December 11th, 1942, just before midnight, the slot, Solomon Islands. The sea was black glass. Lieutenant Jack Gamble stood on the bridge of PT-37, eyes straining into the darkness, the warm Pacific wind knifing through his sweat-soaked shirt. Ahead there was nothing, no horizon, no stars, just a wall of ink. Behind him, the dim green glow of the instrument panel, the soft hum of engines idling at low revolutions. Somewhere out there, a Japanese destroyer squadron was racing down the slot on another Tokyo Express run, fast, brutal, and all but unstoppable. And tonight, 3 little boats made of plywood were supposed to stop them. You can almost feel the absurdity of it. 90-foot motor torpedo boats, small enough to be hauled out on ramps, thin-skinned enough to be punched through by rifle fire, hunting ships 10 times their size, armored in steel and bristling with guns. On paper, it was suicidal. But on paper, the Japanese didn't believe PT boats mattered. Gamble glanced at his watch. 23:40 hours. "Engines ready?" he called down. "Ready, skipper," came the answer from below. "Turbos primed. She'll jump when you say the word." Around PT-37, 2 other boats, PT-40 and PT-48, held position in the darkness, engines whispering, crews at their stations. Torpedo men crouched by their tubes. Gunners gripped the handles of their .50 caliber Brownings, eyes sweeping the night for the first hint of a muzzle flash. They had one advantage that the big destroyers didn't have. They were nearly invisible. Gamble raised his binoculars, trying not to blink. The orders were simple and insane at the same time. Let the Japanese column come to you. Hold fire. No running lights, no radar transmissions, no bravado. Let the giants walk past before you try to cut their legs out from under them. For an hour, nothing. Just the slap of small waves against the hull and the quiet, nervous coughing of cigarettes passing from hand to hand. Men who'd spent their war on tiny boats that smelled of gasoline and sweat and fear, waiting for the one moment when everything might change. Then somebody on the bow hissed, "Skipper, bearing green 15, low on the horizon." Gamble swung his binoculars. There. A smear of darker black on black, then another, and another. The faintest suggestion of stacked pagoda masts and narrow predatory bows knifing through the water. Japanese destroyers. Multiple. He felt his heartbeat slow, not speed up. The moment he'd been waiting for was here, and panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Sound battle stations," he said quietly. The klaxon gave a muted wail. The boat came alive. Engines throttled up a notch. PT-37 nosed forward, sliding into an intercept course at just over idle speed, her wake almost invisible. Out here, noise would kill as surely as a shell. To the Japanese lookouts staring into the same dark, these boats would be nothing, whitecaps, phantom shadows. The enemy command believed PTs were little more than pests, plywood mosquitoes that could harass convoys, maybe wound a transport if they got lucky. But they did not believe those tiny boats carried torpedoes that could break a destroyer's back. Not yet. "Range?" Gamble asked. "Closing. Under 4,000 yards and dropping." Too far. The American Mark 8 torpedoes slung in their tubes were deadly, but only if you got uncomfortably close. 1,000 yards was ideal. Less was better. Any farther than their unreliable engines and tight spread left too much to chance. Which meant they had to sprint, straight at a column of destroyers loaded with guns. Gamble's mouth went dry. "Stand by to accelerate," he said. "On my mark, now!" The engines roared as he shoved the throttles forward. The PT boat lurched, spray exploding out to either side as she clawed up onto plane, going from a whisper to a full-throated snarl in seconds. Behind her and beside her, PT-40 and PT-48 did the same, 3 white wakes carving toward the black shapes of the Japanese column. If they hadn't been spotted before, they would be now. "Hold steady," he shouted over the engine noise. "Torpedoes ready." On the bow and amidships, torpedo men yanked off safety pins, checked gyro angles, hands were poised over firing levers. 4 tubes per boat, 12 chances to prove the skeptics wrong. The Japanese formation loomed larger with each heartbeat, dark hulls resolving from shadow into shape. Range ticked down. 2,000 yards. 1,500. 1,000. Every instinct in Gamble's body screamed at him to turn away, to jink, to do anything but charge straight into the guns of destroyers whose main batteries could turn his boat to splinters in one hit. But if he turned now, the torpedoes would miss, and then the destroyers would still be there tomorrow, still running troops and supplies, still tearing into American convoys. "Steady," he roared over the engine noise. "This is it. This is our shot." For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to a single line. 3 fragile PT boats racing at a wall of steel and arrogance. And then the range clocks hit 900 yards. "Fire!" Compressed air slammed into the torpedo tubes with a dull thud. Gamble felt PT-37 shudder as her fish leapt into the water, 4 white trails streaking away like ghostly fingers reaching for the looming shapes ahead. He yanked the wheel hard over. "Hard to port! Full throttle! Get us the hell out of here!" The boat heeled, engines howling as she carved a desperate turn away from the Japanese guns. Somewhere behind him, PT-40 and PT-48 were doing the same. All 3 boats now exposed, profiles lit faintly by their own foaming wakes. Gamble waited for the flash of enemy guns, the hammer blow of shells finding their range, the spray of splinters. Instead, he heard something else, a distant, hollow, stomach-punching roar. Then a second, then a third. He turned just in time to see a sheet of water and orange flame erupt from the side of a Japanese destroyer near the rear of the column, Tanaka's flagship, the explosion blooming up and out, lifting the stern out of the water as if some giant hand had punched the hull from below. For the first time, a Japanese destroyer squadron learned the hard truth. Those plywood mosquitoes carried a sting that could kill a giant. And in that instant, every assumption the Imperial Navy held about America's little PT boats began to collapse. To understand why that one explosion mattered so much, you have to step back almost a year, back to the days when Japan's destroyer captains quite literally laughed at the idea of American PT boats. Spring 1942, Rabaul, Truk, Kavieng, the forward bases of the Imperial Japanese Navy were humming with confidence. Their destroyers were the Greyhounds of the Pacific, fast, heavily armed, and crewed by men trained to the edge of exhaustion in night fighting. They had every reason to feel untouchable. Japanese doctrine was built on the big guns and long legs of their capital ships. Destroyers carried the famous Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, oxygen-fueled monsters that could kill a cruiser at 20,000 meters. They were used to silencing enemy ships with a single spread, then vanishing into the night on columns of white spray. Then the first rumors came in from the Solomons. American motor torpedo boats. Tiny. Wooden. Loud as hell. The Japanese sailors who first saw them up close during the Guadalcanal campaign couldn't believe these things were meant for combat. Compared to a sleek Fubuki or Kagero-class destroyer, a PT boat looked like a toy, barely 90 feet long, made of laminated wood, packed with gasoline and sporting guns that looked like something off a coastal trawler. Mosquitoes, one officer called them. Irritating, perhaps. Dangerous in numbers, maybe. But not truly threatening. Their first encounters seemed to confirm that arrogance. PTs would dash in at night, engines screaming, searchlights flicking on and off as gunners blazed away at distant destroyers. The Japanese ships would simply increase speed, throw up walls of 5-inch fire, and watch the little boats skid away in fountains of spray. Few, if any, hits were confirmed. The long lance still ruled the night. What the Japanese didn't see was how quickly the Americans were learning. On those flimsy devil boats, as some U.S. crews called them, officers and enlisted men dissected each failed attack. They realized that charging in on visible wakes and roaring engines was suicide, that firing torpedoes at extreme ranges and hoping for a miracle was a waste of torpedoes. They needed stealth, patience, geometry. By late 1942, PT tactics had changed. Instead of charging headlong, boats began lurking in likely choke points, narrow passages, predictable routes, the places the so-called Tokyo Express had to pass through on its high-speed resupply runs. Engines at idle. Radar, when available, is used sparingly. Crews trained to read the night, the faint shape of a ship's bow wave, the barely perceptible change in the darkness that meant steel, not water. On the Japanese side, intelligence officers continued to downplay the threat. Reports noted that American PT torpedoes were old Mark 8s, World War I designs with shorter range and smaller warheads than the Long Lance. They pointed out that many PT attacks ended with no confirmed hits, just wasted torpedoes and burning boats. What those reports didn't emphasize was this: when a Mark 8 did hit, it could still tear the guts out of a destroyer. The Americans knew it. The PT crews believed it. They just needed the right shot. Back in the slot, word from that December night's hit on a Japanese destroyer, the blast that lit up the column and rocked a flagship, began to spread like wildfire through the small, gasoline-stinking world of the motor torpedo boat squadrons. At first, it was just rumors. Hey, you hear 37 put a fish into a tin can last week? Bull. Our torpedoes never run straight. I'm telling you, Skipper says he saw the stern lift clear out of the water. Big one, too. One of Tanaka's boys. In a war where PT crews had watched too many of their own boats shredded by shell fire or set ablaze by a single lucky hit, the idea that they'd finally landed a decisive blow on the giant they'd been snapping at felt almost too good to believe. The Japanese, for their part, reacted the way any proud warrior culture does when confronted with an unpleasant surprise. They denied it. Initial battle reports wrote off the explosion as a magazine fire, or a boiler room accident, or a misfired Long Lance torpedo that had turned traitor and detonated too close to its launching ship. Anything but the notion that a 90-foot plywood boat could deliver a crippling strike to a destroyer purpose-built for night combat. But below the official denial, a quiet dread began to grow. Because the men who stood on those destroyer decks, who felt the concussion of that blast, who saw water and flame erupt from their comrade's hull, understood something their superiors didn't want to put on paper. The Americans' mosquito fleet had teeth. And once a predator realizes its bite can draw real blood, everything changes. In the cramped wardrooms of Japanese destroyers, conversations shifted ever so slightly. How many PTs were reported in this sector? Do we have orders on engagement priorities? Bombers, subs, surface ships, and now these boats. What if they get a lucky shot at close range? Luck.
That's how they framed it. A fluke, an accident of geometry and timing. They still didn't grasp the truth. There was nothing accidental about what the Americans were learning to do with their PTs. On a chart table back at Tulagi, a young lieutenant was drawing lines, speed, bearing, torpedo run times, turning chaos into angles and timing windows. Finding the place where a clumsy old Mark 8, loosed from a fragile wooden boat, could intersect the path of a warship built to dominate the night. He looked at the pencil marks and realized something that should have terrified every destroyer captain in the Imperial Navy. With the right approach, the right timing, and the right nerve, those plywood mosquitoes didn't just have a chance. In close range, in confined waters, they had an edge. And somewhere out in the dark, men like Jack Gamble were already planning how to use it.
By early 1943, the myth of the invincible Tokyo Express was starting to crack, but only just. In the Solomons, PT boat crews were fighting a very personal war against destroyers they could barely see and almost never hurt. Every night patrol felt like the same bad dream. Race to an intercept point, pick up vague contacts, charge in under fire, loose torpedoes that either missed, ran too deep, or refused to explode, then run for your life under a rain of 5-inch shells. On the charts back at base, the lines always looked promising. Out on the water, they mostly ended in frustration and splintered wood. You can imagine the mood in those sweaty, diesel-soaked briefing huts. Crews hunched over mugs of coffee that tasted like burned rope, listening to yet another officer talk about improving tactics and closing the range, when everybody in the room knew the real problem. The torpedoes were unreliable, and the destroyers were not. But a strange thing happens when you keep throwing the same small group of determined people at an impossible problem. They start to solve it. One of the first lessons was brutal. Speed wasn't your friend. Early doctrine said PT boats should attack at high speed, zigzagging in at 30 to 40 knots to throw off enemy gunners. In practice, all that did was light them up like Christmas trees. Huge wakes, roaring engines, muzzle flashes like beacons in the night. The Japanese didn't have to guess where to aim. So the smarter skippers began to slow down. They learned to hide in the shadows, using islands and headlands as cover, to creep into firing position at barely more than a crawl, bows pointed across the expected path of the enemy instead of charging straight at it, to trust the geometry more than the adrenaline. Another lesson: fire fewer torpedoes, not more. In the disastrous early ambushes, PT divisions would often unleash every fish they had in wild, spread-out salvos, dozens of torpedoes launched in hope rather than design. The result was predictable: no hits, empty tubes, and no second chances. Gamble and skippers like him started doing the opposite. 2, maybe 4 torpedoes, carefully aimed, fired at close range with a planned escape route already in mind. The goal wasn't to blanket the sea with steel and hope for a miracle. It was to create one precise moment where an enemy destroyer would be in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. And then there was the mindset shift. At first, PT crews thought of themselves as miniature destroyers, fast attackers meant to charge in, fight it out, and then roar away victorious. After watching too many friends get blown apart by shell fire, they realized they were something closer to an ambush predator. Strike from the shadows, hit first, hit once, then disappear. It wasn't glamorous. There was no glory in creeping around in the dark, engines throttled down, listening for the rumble of bigger ships. But it was effective. Sitting in those cramped wardrooms and tent messes, officers began marking up charts differently.
Instead of placing their boats where they hoped the enemy might be, they layered intelligence reports, traffic patterns, geography, pinch points, shallow passages, predictable turns. If you know a destroyer is doing 30 knots down a narrow channel at a set time every night, you don't have to chase it. You just have to wait. That December night when Gamble's PT division put torpedoes into a destroyer wasn't a fluke. It was the first clean proof that all those ugly, painful lessons were paying off, that the Mark 8s, for all their faults, could still rip open the side of a warship if you were willing to get close enough. Word of that success didn't just boost morale, it changed doctrine. Suddenly, the higher-ups who'd written off PTs as morale projects, good for headlines and not much else, had to take a second look. Reports started to include more than just tonnage sunk. They talked about disruption of enemy resupply, forced maneuver, Tokyo Express delayed. That meant something. Because every time a destroyer captain had to dodge a suspected torpedo track, every time he swung his ship wide to avoid a dark patch of water where PTs might be lurking, his perfect timetable slipped. Troops arrived late, supplies didn't make it, carefully planned reinforcement schedules turned messy and dangerous. If you're Japan, fighting a war across thousands of miles of ocean with limited shipping, that kind of disruption is poison. On the American side, the men at desks, those far from the spray and the noise, were starting to realize that these small, maddeningly fragile boats were doing something no cruiser or battleship could. They were turning geography into a weapon. Shallow water? Big ships hate it. PTs live in it. Narrow passages? Perfect for torpedo traps. Bad weather? Low visibility, confusing coastlines? Where a destroyer captain saw risk, a PT boat skipper saw opportunity. None of this made the PT war less deadly. For every successful ambush, there were still nights where the only thing a boat brought home was fresh scars and another empty bunk. The destroyers were still faster, still tougher, still terrifying when they opened up with every gun they had. But little by little, the balance of fear began to shift. Not in any official report, not in the mind of some admiral staring at a map. Where it mattered most. In the heads of the men standing on destroyer bridges, peering into the dark, wondering if that faint smudge off the port bow was just a wave or a plywood boat, idling in silence, waiting for them to walk into a killing zone. That's the thing about a new kind of threat. Once it proves it can hurt you, it doesn't have to kill you every time. It just has to make you doubt. And doubt is deadly in the dark.
There's a big difference between knowing, in theory, that your weapon can kill a giant and watching a giant actually fall. For the PT crews in the Solomons, that moment came on a night when everything that could go right finally did. Iron Bottom Sound, late 1943. The water here had earned its name the hard way, crammed with the rusting hulks of cruisers, destroyers, and transports from a year of brutal fighting around Guadalcanal. For the men on the little boats, it felt like they were skimming over a graveyard every time they opened the throttles. This night, the graveyard was about to claim something new. Intelligence was clear. Another Tokyo Express run was coming down the slot. Destroyers again. Fast, experienced, the kind of ships whose crews thought they'd seen every trick the Americans could throw at them. So the PTs set their own trap. Instead of spreading out in a loose picket, a handful of boats massed near a predictable turn in the Japanese route, a place where the destroyers would have to slow, even if only a little, to snake through reef-studded water. Speed was life for the Tokyo Express, but even greyhounds have to watch their footing. On one of those boats, the skipper had a plan that bordered on insane. "We're not firing from 1,000 yards, not 800. We're going into 500, maybe less." Someone stared at him. "Sir, at 500 yards, their lookouts can see the brand of your cigarettes." He nodded. "And at 500 yards, if a fish hits, it breaks their spine. We've been bleeding for a year out here. Tonight, we make them bleed." The crew went quiet, because he was right. So they waited. Engines at idle, running lights off, men breathing shallow so even their lungs wouldn't seem too loud in the cramped spaces. You can almost feel the way every sound on the boat suddenly seemed indecent, every creak of timber, every clink of metal magnified against the hush of the sea. Then, faint and far off, they heard it. Not seen, heard. A low rhythmic growl rolling over the water like distant thunder. Destroyer screws. The PT skipper moved his boat ahead at barely more than a whisper, threading through shadows and moon-silvered patches, always keeping some strip of darkness between him and the sound. Radar, when it worked, gave him a rough bearing. The rest was instinct and experience, knowing how fast a destroyer captain liked to run that stretch, how often he checked for threats when he might be looking the wrong way. Minutes stretched. The screws grew louder. And then, suddenly, there it was, a darker shape against the already black horizon. Bow wave just visible as a paler smudge. No lights, of course, just mass and momentum. The skipper felt the hairs on his neck stand up. The geometry in his head clicked into place. "Come right, now," he said quietly. The boat eased into a new course that would cross the destroyer's projected path at a sharp angle. Not head-on, too easy to spot. Not parallel, too hard to lead the shot. Somewhere in between, in that slim slice of mathematics where a 21-inch torpedo running at around 35 knots could intersect a steel hull doing over 25. Range? Closing, 700 yards, 650. The destroyer was starting to loom now, details emerging. You could make out the shape of the bridge, the fore-turret, the stubby barrels of secondary guns. Men on the PT boat could see tiny pinpricks of light where cigarettes glowed on the enemy's bridge. Unthinkable on an American ship this close to enemy waters, but the Tokyo Express ran on confidence as much as fuel. They genuinely did not believe a mosquito could take them down. 500 yards, someone whispered. The skipper felt sweat trickle down his back, cold despite the tropical night. "Stand by, tubes 1 and 2. Aim, midships just aft the bridge. Set depth, shallow. I want it under the boilers." He took a breath he didn't remember deciding to take. "Fire!" Two dull thumps as compressed air punched the torpedoes out of their tubes. The boat rocked slightly as weight left the rails. In the dark water ahead, white trails bloomed like ghostly scars angling towards the destroyer's flank. The skipper didn't wait to admire his work. Hard left, full throttle. The PT spun, engine screaming as she bolted for the nearest patch of deeper darkness. On the destroyer's bridge, somebody finally saw something that didn't look like just another wave. Shouts, a bell, the hard, urgent blare of a whistle. Too late. The first torpedo hit just under the forward engine room, a brutal, gut-punching blast that seemed to lift the side of the ship out of the water. Men on the PT boat felt the shock through their own thin hull. A column of water and flame erupted upward, higher than the destroyer's masts, lit from within by burning fuel and fragments of metal scything through the night. A second hit followed half a heartbeat later, closer to the stern. This one twisted the ship literally, torquing steel that had never been meant to flex that way. Lights flickered on the destroyer's superstructure, then died. The long, predatory shape that had terrorized these waters suddenly looked wounded, sagging. On the PT, there was a sound nobody expected to hear in that moment. Laughter. Not because it was funny, because it was unreal.
because for a year these men had been told their boats were a nuisance at best, sacrifices at worst, and now, right in front of them, a ship 10 times their size was burning because they had decided, collectively, that it didn't have to be invincible. The destroyer tried to fight back. Guns barked wildly into the night, tracers clawing at where the PT had been a moment ago. But with power gone on one shaft, the big ship couldn't maneuver properly. She slewed, bleeding speed, trailing smoke and flame. Some of the crew, dazed, were already abandoning ship. Black silhouettes leaping into blacker water lit only by the orange hell behind them. On the radio nets later, on both sides, the reports would argue over details. Which boat had fired, how many hits, how exactly the giant finally died, whether fire reached the magazines, whether it broke in half, whether it sank slowly or rolled and went under. To the PT crews who watched from a safe distance, one image stayed burned in memory. A destroyer. A real, steel, proud Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer. Not just damaged. Gone. Word spread faster than official communiques ever could. Across the scattered world of the PT squadrons, Rendova, Tulagi, New Guinea, the Marshalls, stories bounced from boat to boat. Did you hear? They got one. A big one. Not a transport? No, a tin can. One of the fast boys. For the men on those plywood decks, it wasn't just a tactical victory. It was proof. Proof that their war, fought from tiny platforms reeking of gasoline and sweat, mattered just as much as the clashes of battleships and carriers splashed across newspapers back home. Proof that if you learned, adapted, and refused to accept the limits other people drew for you, even a mosquito could kill a giant. And somewhere in a Japanese wardroom, over a chart that used to be comforting, a destroyer captain ran his finger down a route he'd traveled a dozen times before, and hesitated. Because now, in the back of his mind, he knew what he hadn't known a month earlier. Out there, in the dark, he'd once considered his ally, small wooden boats were waiting with weapons that could send him to the bottom in a matter of seconds. The math of the Pacific had changed, and it wasn't changing in Japan's favor.